Ever look through these camera manuals? Me either. This is my new one for my X-T3. Whenever I get a new camera, I always find myself looking for one small nugget of information in these manuals, which I can never find. This manual wasn't too bad. The one that came with my Sony was really bad, but I ultimately end up just jumping over to YouTube and finding a video on it. I usually find that's the best way. But what's so interesting about these manuals is that, obviously the purpose of these manuals is to help you become more comfortable with your new camera. But they really just discuss kind of the how-to technical side of things. So things like how to turn on your camera, how to attach a lens, or how to use your flash, things like that. But it doesn't truly tell you how to really become comfortable with your camera. Those are all kind of things you kind of got to figure out on your own. It's not going to tell you what your camera does well and what your camera doesn't do well. It's not going to tell you what situations your camera performs the best in and what situations your camera performs the worst in. That's up to you to kind of figure out, and the manual is not going to help you with that. And that process usually takes a little while. It's a lot of trial and error. It could take you 6 months. It could take you a year or even longer of using your camera in real life situations to figure out exactly how it operates the best and how do you become the most comfortable with your camera. And that's really the purpose of this week's video, is to discuss 3 specific settings and 3 really simple tests you can do at home. You don't have to go to any amazing location to do these. You can do everything right in your backyard. And not only will it help you to become more comfortable with these 3 settings if you're not comfortable already, but most importantly, it'll help you to understand exactly what your camera does better and what your camera does best and what your camera does not perform so good at. And it'll also help you to become more comfortable with your camera. And that's actually the most important part, because, let's face it, us as humans, we generally don't enjoy things that confuse us. If we're not really comfortable with it, we don't enjoy it near as much as we would if we were comfortable with it. So being comfortable with your camera is a very integral part of the overall enjoyment of photography, of course. So to jump right into it, the first thing has to do with shutter speed. And without having to dig into the real technical aspects of shutter speed, I look at shutter speed 2 different ways. One way has to do with exposure. So if you're shooting with a very quick shutter speed, it's opening and closing very quickly, that's not allowing a lot of light to get to your sensor, which will ultimately result in your image being less exposed. Now, if you're shooting with a much slower shutter speed, that's allowing more light to get to your sensor, which will ultimately result in your image being more exposed, more brightly exposed. So that's the exposure side of shutter speed. Now, the other side of shutter speed I look at is really related to movement. Now, you have positive movement and negative movement. Positive movement in landscape photography usually has to do with things like clouds moving or water running. We usually like to show a little bit of movement there. Not always. Sometimes you like to freeze the action. You don't like the clouds to be moving at all. You don't like the water to be moving at all. But just understanding exactly what you can and can't do from a creative aspect with your shutter speed is a very beneficial thing to understand, not only with your photography, but just with the overall exposure triangle and understanding exactly how that operates. Now, when I first got into photography, this test that I'll show you here, this is the single thing that helped me understand shutter speed the most, because shutter speed really escaped me and confused me when I first got into photography. And this is super simple to do. All you need is moving water. It could be a waterfall, a river, a small creek or a stream. You could even do this with a sprinkler in your backyard. Just put your camera on a tripod, put it into shutter priority, and find out whatever shutter speed freezes whatever water that you're shooting. So I did it right here. This is a local reservoir right by my house, and 1/250th of a second is what was required to show no motion in the water. And as you can see, the water is frozen here. Now, if we start to lower the shutter speed, this is 1/125th of a second, still pretty frozen, really no movement. Now this is at 1/60th of a second, and this is where you're going to start to see the movement in the water start to creep in. Now, if I slow my shutter speed down even more to 1/30th of a second, you can see even more movement. Now 1/15th of a second, a lot of movement. And this is kind of the movement that I like in my photography. I usually don't like to have really long shutter speeds to where the water loses all of its detail and it almost kind of starts to look milky. I like to have my shutter speed fast enough to show a little bit of motion in the water, but at the same time retain a little bit of structure and detail in the water. So I like the way 1/15th of a second looks. 1/8 of a second also looks good, and half a second looks good as well too. So this just kind of gives you a frame of reference of what you might like. I personally like 1/15 of a second, probably 1/8 of a second. But just going through this activity at home will help you, one, to better understand shutter speed if you're not comfortable with it at all, if you're not comfortable with it already, and two, it'll help you to understand exactly what you like from a photographic perspective. What is your taste? What do you want your moving water to look like? So it's just kind of a good frame of reference to go off of. So the next time that you're on location and you're shooting a waterfall or a river, you know that you don't have to start off at 1/100th of a second. You know you can jump on down to 1/8 of a second, and then maybe try out 1/5 of a second or a half a second to see exactly what that water blur, what that water motion is going to look like. Now, a lot of that has to do with the flow of the water. If you're photographing a raging waterfall, that's going to require a certain, specific shutter speed. Or if you're photographing a creek that barely has any water moving in it, that will require a different shutter speed. But just going through this activity will help you to better understand shutter speed and its effect on water. Because sometimes you might want to freeze water, and sometimes you might want to show motion. Here's a good example right here. This is a photograph from last fall where I had a longer shutter speed, for me, a half a second. And it lost a lot of its detail, but I really like the way this image looks with a slower shutter speed. Now this image here, this is a massive waterfall in Hawaii, and I wanted to freeze this one. This was shot with 1/1000th of a second, and you can see if I zoom all the way in here, the water has no motion at all. And I really wanted to do that just to show kind of how ferocious this waterfall is, the grand scale and how huge this is, and the raging water that was pouring off the top of this cliff. And I kind of felt that told a story more with a fast shutter speed. And I really think that worked in this situation, because if this was a long shutter speed, I don't think this image would have the same effect. So there's different ways to use it creatively, and it just depends on the situation and your personal taste as well. Now, I had mentioned negative movement earlier. So negative movement, as it relates to shutter speed, has to do with camera movement, specifically camera shake resulting from a handheld shot. So sometimes maybe you forgot your tripod, or you just didn't bring your tripod, or maybe something's happening so fast that you are forced to handhold a shot. In camera technology today is fantastic at this. Many cameras offer in-body image stabilization or optical stabilization. And if you have both of those combined, I mean, that's a fantastic situation to be in. A lot of times you might have just a body that has image stabilization, or maybe just a lens, but either way, you're gonna be able to use a slower shutter speed than ever without stabilization. And this test is very simple to perform. And the ultimate goal here is to figure out how low can you go on your shutter speed and still walk away with a reasonably sharp image. So this is just a fire pit in my backyard. I'm hand holding this, and I'm focusing right here on this edge of this rock. And I started at 1/60th of a second, and I just start to reduce my shutter speed over and over and over again, with the ultimate goal trying to figure out exactly where this rock is no longer in focus. So I mean, we're all the way down to 1/13th of a second, 1/10th of a second, 1/8 of a second, even 1/6 of a second still looks good. That's a very slow shutter speed. 1/5 of a second. And right around here is where we start to lose it. Like almost a half a second, even 1/3 of a second starts to show a little bit of motion blur, 1/4 of a second. So right around probably right here. So now, just by conducting this test, which only took a matter of a couple minutes to do, I now know that with my 16-35, I can handhold that for almost 1/5 of a second, or actually right at about 1/5 of a second, and still walk away with a reasonably sharp image. And that's powerful information to know, because if things are happening quick, you do not have time to go through all these different shutter speeds to figure out if it's sharp. Plus, when you look on the back of the LCD on your camera, it's really hard to see if it's in focus or if everything is in sharp or not. So knowing your handheld shutter speed minimum is a great thing to know before you get in a situation where you're going to actually need it. Now, a lot of this has to do with technique too. I always shoot with a 2-second timer, whether I'm on a tripod or I'm hand holding something, just because it'll take the shake away from you actually pressing the shutter. I always press the shutter down, breathe out slowly, and then it takes the image. And usually that's a recipe for a pretty good handheld shot. You can go pretty low. But nevertheless, just understanding what you can do is good information to become comfortable with. Now, the second part of this has to do with ISO, and more specifically, what ISO can you take your camera to? Now, the manual is not going to tell you, I mean, the manual might tell you how high you can go on your ISO, but it's not going to tell you like what looks good or where to stop as far as usability goes of an image. So what I did, once again, super simple. I took an old camera and I put it on a fence post in my backyard, and I set up my tripod and camera, and I just started taking images of this camera over and over again, increasing my ISO to try and figure out what level I could take my ISO to and still walk away with a usable image. So right here, this is ISO 50. This is the base ISO of the Sony a7R II. And as you can see, there is really no noise in this image whatsoever. And then if I start to kind of go through here, if I go up to say 2000, that's where you start to see noise. And let me go back here and kind of compare these images together here. I think it's a little bit easier to see. So this is ISO 50 and this is ISO 2000. This is the level where it started to get a little bit noisy. Now I think ISO 2000 on my camera will be fine with maybe a little bit of noise reduction in Lightroom, but ultimately it'll walk away with plenty good of an image. There's not a whole lot of noise. I'm not losing a lot of sharpness in the image, and I think it'll be okay. But if I start to go any higher than that, so let me click on this again. If I go up to ISO 3200 compared to 2000, let me find my camera. Where are you? There he is. You can see quite a bit more noise there. And then I actually took it all the way up to the max ISO just for curiosity, because I think the max ISO, 102,400 is the max ISO of the Sony a7R II, and here's what it looks like. This is the 102,400 ISO compared to ISO 2000. So I just thought that was interesting. Actually, if you zoom all the way out, it still doesn't look too bad, but I thought that was a pretty interesting test to go through, that once again, it only takes a couple minutes to do. And now I know that whenever I get into a situation where I need ISO, that right around 2000 is about as high as I want to go, and still walk away with a very usable image. I don't use ISO much in landscape photography. I'm almost always on a tripod, and if I need additional exposure, I usually just lengthen out my shutter speed. But sometimes you can't do that. So if you're shooting moving water, if you're shooting a waterfall at sunrise or sunset, and there's not a lot of ambient light, and you need to have a little bit longer shutter speed to properly expose the scene, that shutter speed might be too long, and it might end up making your water look like a soupy mess and lose all of its texture. In that situation, you might want to introduce a little bit of ISO to quicken up that shutter speed to get the right amount of movement in the water while still properly exposing your scene. And then the other common issue is if you are shooting on a windy day and you're shooting at sunrise or sunset and the wind is blowing leaves or branches in a tree, and you need to lengthen out your shutter speed, slow your shutter speed down to properly expose the scene, but that's going to introduce blur in the leaves and the branches of the tree. So you could also introduce ISO there to still properly expose the image, but also get a shutter speed fast enough to where you don't get blurred leaves or blurred branches in trees or anything like that. So just knowing how high you can go on your ISO comfortably is very, very good information to know. Now, the final component of this has to do with aperture. And I made a video, I think it was last summer, about finding your sweet spot of a lens. And what I mean by sweet spot, and every lens has a sweet spot, the aperture in which the lens performs its best. It's at its sharpest in the center and in the corners. And once again, the manual for the lens isn't going to tell you this. The only way to figure it out is to just figure it out for yourself. And I'll link the video above here if you want to take a look at that. But it's a real simple process to do. You can do that at home as well, but just figure out exactly what the sharpest aperture is for all of your lenses. That's good information to know as well. But for this video, I'm talking about aperture from a perspective of depth of field. What aperture can you use to get the most depth of field? And I know you're thinking, oh, that's easy, f/22. And you're right. f/22 will get you the most depth of field. But lenses start to suffer from something called diffraction in really high aperture levels. So really once you get up to above f/16, so f/18, 20, 22, lenses suffer from diffraction, which ultimately means it's degradation in the overall sharpness of the image. So an image shot at usually f8, f9, or even maybe f7 or right around that range, that's usually going to be where your lens is the sharpest. Every lens is a little bit different, but when you get it to like f16 and f18, those usually aren't the sharpest values for your particular lens. F16 is usually the maximum that I like to go. And this test here, very easy to do. This is a picture of my backyard. This is my fence. And what I did is I put down a tape measure, and I put the tape measure starting right at where my lens element starts, and I extended it out roughly about 8 feet. And what I did is I focused on infinity, which in this situation happens to be the trees all the way here in the back. And I just started taking image after image. This one's at f2.8, and obviously that's not going to have a lot of depth of field. So I'm just going to move through here, and really at about f9 is where I could start to see the depth of field creeping closer to me. And at about f9, you can start to see the actual tape measure here starting to become in focus. And this is going to be 8 feet from my actual lens. So at about 8 feet is at f9. Now, if I move this to f11, which is generally where I shoot at, and I zoom in here, you can see that the 6 foot marker here is in focus. 7 foot, of course, is in focus. And even the 5 foot marker here is in focus. So what this is telling me is that f11, whatever is in my foreground, as long as it is at least 5 feet from the front of my lens, I will be able to get the foreground element sharp, and of course the midground and background element all sharp from the front to back. That way I don't have to focus stack my image, and I'll be able to capture it in just one single image. So using f11, I can just keep that in my mind at 5 feet. Whatever's in the foreground needs to be a minimum of 5 feet away. And then I did the same thing at f13. And f14. So if I come down to f14, you'll notice that even the 4 feet marker is in focus. 5 feet's in focus and 4 feet's in focus. And if I change this to f16, which is the highest I'll ever go, it looks like even like 3.5 feet appears to be in focus. So I know when I'm on location that if I'm using f16, the barrier of focus is about 3.5 feet from my lens element. So whatever is in my foreground needs to be at least 3.5 feet away from my lens in order to be in focus along with the midground and the background. And if it's not, then I might want to get into a focus stacking exercise at that point. But that is very, very good information to know, and I would recommend doing that with all of your lenses to figure out exactly what aperture you need to be at to properly get everything in your image sharp from the front to the back. So that's good information to know as well. So once again, all of these tests are very simple to do. Did them all in my backyard except for that one shutter speed test, but you could do everything in your house. I think I spent maybe 30 minutes conducting all of these tests, and this is information that will last you the life of your camera, or really as long as you're in photography. So it's definitely well worth the time. And, I hope you were able to get at least a couple good pieces of information out of this week's video. If you have any questions, definitely leave them in the comments section below, and I promise I will get back in touch with you. And if you enjoyed this week's video, if you could give it a thumbs up, it definitely helps out the channel. And if you enjoy the content I'm creating, if you could subscribe to the channel, that would definitely mean the world to me as well. And as always, I really appreciate you watching this week's video, and I'll see you next week. Bye.